Pastor Ben Miller here again from Bumpville Bible Church, and today we're again looking at another one of Karl and Marx and Engels' planks in the Communist Manifesto. And today we're not actually going to spend a lot of time on this one today, but today we're going to look at number 8, and that is equal liability of all to labor. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. And certainly on the surface this doesn't seem like such a terrible idea, right? Equal liability of all to labor. Oh, that sounds good. You know, everybody should take on responsibility to labor, but then at the same time, I think what ought to happen here is we should just raise questions. I just want to raise questions about this and cause you to think about that. Because are we requiring people here that are older and maybe not able to labor in this way anymore to labor? Certainly communism would say no, but you know, if we look at the history of socialism in a lot of different countries, we should really ask ourselves questions about that. But really the second part, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture, right? The establishment of industrious armies. Now, the question I'm going to ask us today is, should the government enslave its own people? And probably most of you would say no. But when you think about what Marx is saying, right, the establishment of industrious armies, especially for agriculture. What armies, how are these armies going to be established? Is the government just going to hire people, or is the government going to force people? I mean, a lot of armies, especially we see again in socialist countries, it's conscription, right? You're drafted into the army, so why wouldn't you not draft into these armies? And then, of course, you also have the problem of they must be doing government property, you know, so you have a lot of people losing their private property, their private farms, their private industry in order that the government can create these armies to go out and work, or you even have the government creating its own work, paying their workers maybe better than what the private person can pay and driving them out of business that way. So you have some things here that may look good on paper, but then again, once the government has established itself as a monopoly, they don't really have to pay people $15 an hour or whatever it is. They can lower that minimum wage, or they can cause inflation to happen and not raise it. So there's a lot of issues and a lot of questions with that. And it would seem that, again, from history, that we're seeing more of enslavement than anything else. Now, Scripture does speak to some of these things. Particularly if we think about working and labor, it gives a warning to the rich. I think it's really warning the rich as individuals. But why would this be any different for government? The Apostle James says in James 5:4, "Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you." And this is talking about the rich person. And I think this is true not just of people as individuals who may hire people who have their own businesses, but isn't it not true of the government? Right? Government officials, they are rich, they have money, and now they're overseeing these industrial armies. Okay? And since they have a monopoly on it, they really get to determine what you make. And since you're the government, what good is really having a union going to do at that point? Because they're the government. They have all the power, they have all the authority, they can do whatever they want. It really puts government in a position to where they can manipulate things. And I think we're foolish if we just assume, well, our government would never do that. Our leaders would never do that. We know big government, big bureaucracy almost always tends to be corrupt. And the bigger it is, the more corrupt it tends to be. And we're actually seeing some of that even right now in our nation. So those are things, and even though maybe the people in power right now might not be corrupt or misusing the position of power, sometime along the way somebody's going to come in who will, and since there's no checks and balances, what do you have? And unfortunately, that's what socialism calls for. And of course, our own Constitution outlaws slavery, but I think slavery, even when it's the government doing it, is still wrong. Just because we don't allow individual people, which we should not, to own slaves, why should the government be allowed to own slaves, even though they're a lot trickier about how they go about it? And this also, I think, goes against the principle of free labor. See, when you have multiple industries that are privately owned and multiple businesses, and the government actually does what's supposed to and breaks up monopolies because monopolies take away the idea of a free market, okay? And they even talk about this somewhat in the Federalist Papers, which are worth reading, and even our Constitution talks about the government. The main power of the government is not to establish its own monopoly, but to break up other monopolies so free market can exist, and then you have competition. Because the businesses that want the best employees will have to what? Pay more to get the better employees. And that is what drives price up. And if you're an employee, then there's a lot of incentive to work hard to refine your skills so that someone will pay you to work for them. And so that is really, I believe, more effective. If you read, again, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, you see that. That's how nations become wealthy. They tend to accumulate wealth by allowing things to operate in a free market. They tend to lose wealth when they try more of a socialistic approach and to control things. And so that's really the problem here with Marx's ideology here in number 8, is that it's government controlled, and that just can lead to a lot of problems. So the answer is no, right? Government should not enslave its own people. And you might say, well, Marx didn't say that there, that, well, the government should enslave people. That's true, but what tends to happen when governments enact this stuff? They tends to lead to governments enslaving its own people, right? And that's what history speaks to. I'm Pastor Ben Miller. Till next time, live long and prosper.